Greetings, lasses and chaps. Welcome to Mystery Maven. Today we shall peruse a thrilling tale, The Queen of Hearts, by Wilkie Collins. Wilkie Collins' novel, The Queen of Hearts, is a canonical example of the Victorian Gothic genre. It is an exploration of the duality of femininity and the power dynamics between men and women in 19th century Britain. Through its use of suspenseful plot points and innovative narrative techniques, Collins examines themes such as family loyalty and betrayal, class boundaries, and psychological manipulation. So let's hie ourselves to the fun. The Queen of Hearts, by Wilkie Collins. The Queen of Hearts. Chapter 1. Ourselves. We were three quiet, lonely old men, and she was a lively, handsome young woman, and we were at our wits' end what to do with her. A word about ourselves, first of all, a necessary word, to explain the singular situation of our fair young guest. We are three brothers, and we live in a barbarous, dismal old house called the Glen Tower. Our place of abode stands in a hilly, lonesome district of South Wales. No such thing as a line of railway runs anywhere near us. No gentleman's seat is within an easy drive of us. We are at an unspeakably inconvenient distance from a town, and the village to which we send for our letters is 3 miles off. My eldest brother, Owen, was brought up to the church. All the prime of his life was passed in a populous London parish. For more years than I now like to reckon up, he worked unremittingly, in defiance of failing health and adverse fortune, amid the multitudinous misery of the London poor, and he would, in all probability, have sacrificed his life to his duty long before the present time, if the Glen Tower had not come into his possession through 2 unexpected deaths in the elder and richer branch of our family. This opening to him of a place of rest and refuge saved his life. No man ever drew breath who better deserved the gifts of fortune. For no man, I sincerely believe, more tender of others, more diffident of himself, more gentle, more generous, and more simple-hearted than Owen ever walked this earth. My second brother, Morgan, started in life as a doctor, and learned all that his profession could teach him at home and abroad. He realized a moderate independence by his practice, beginning in one of our large northern towns and ending as a physician in London. But, although he was well known and appreciated among his brethren, he failed to gain that sort of reputation with the public which elevates a man into the position of a great doctor. The ladies never liked him. In the first place, he was ugly. Morgan will excuse me for mentioning this. In the second place, he was an inveterate smoker, and he smelled of tobacco when he felt languid pulses in elegant bedrooms. In the third place, he was the most formidably outspoken teller of the truth as regarded himself, his profession, and his patients, that ever imperilled the social standing of the science of medicine. For these reasons, and for others which it is not necessary to mention, he never pushed his way, as a doctor, into the front ranks, and he never cared to do so. About a year after Owen came into possession of the Glen Tower, Morgan discovered that he had saved as much money for his old age as a sensible man could want, that he was tired of the active pursuit, or, as he termed it, of the dignified quackery of his profession, and that it was only common charity to give his invalid brother a companion who could physic him for nothing, and so prevent him from getting rid of his money in the worst of all possible ways by wasting it on doctors' bills. In a week after Morgan had arrived at these conclusions, he was settled at the Glen Tower, and from that time, opposite as their characters were, my 2 elder brothers lived together in their lonely retreat, thoroughly understanding and, in their very different ways, heartily loving one another. Many years passed before I, the youngest of the 3 christened by the unmelodious name of Griffith, found my way, in my turn, to the dreary old house and the sheltering quiet of the Welsh hills. My career in life had led me away from my brothers, and even now, when we are all united, I have still ties and interests to connect me with the outer world which neither Owen nor Morgan possess. I was brought up to the bar. After my first year's study of the law, I wearied of it, and strayed aside idly into the brighter and more attractive paths of literature. My occasional occupation with my pen was varied by long travelling excursions in all parts of the continent. Year by year my circle of gay friends and acquaintances increased, and I bade fair to sink into the condition of a wandering, desultory man, without a fixed purpose in life of any sort, when I was saved by what has saved many another in my situation, an attachment to a good and a sensible woman. By the time I had reached the age of 35, I had done what neither of my brothers had done before me. I had married. As a single man, my own small independence, aided by what little additions to it I could pick up with my pen, had been sufficient for my wants, but with marriage and its responsibilities came the necessity for serious exertion. I returned to my neglected studies and grappled resolutely, this time with the intricate difficulties of the law. I was called to the bar. My wife's father aided me with his interest, and I started into practice without difficulty and without delay. For the next 20 years my married life was a scene of happiness and prosperity, on which I now look back with a grateful tenderness that no words of mine can express. The memory of my wife is busy at my heart while I think of those past times. The forgotten tears rise in my eyes again and trouble the course of my pen while it traces these simple lines. Let me pass rapidly over the one unspeakable misery of my life. Let me try to remember now, as I tried to remember then, that she lived to see our only child. Our son, who was so good to her, who is still so good to me, grow up to manhood, that her head lay on my bosom when she died, and that the last frail movement of her hand in this world was the movement that brought it closer to her boy's lips. I bore the blow with God's help. I bore it and bear it still, but it struck me away forever from my hold on social life, from the purposes and pursuits, the companions and the pleasures of 20 years, which her presence had sanctioned and made dear to me. If my son George had desired to follow my profession, I should still have struggled against myself, and have kept my place in the world until I had seen H. prosperous and settled. But his choice led him to the army, and before his mother's death he had obtained his commission, and had entered on his path in life. No other responsibility remained to claim from me the sacrifice of myself. My brothers had made my place ready for me by their fireside. My heart yearned, in its desolation, for the friends and companions of the old boyish days. My good, brave son promised that no year should pass, as long as he was in England, without his coming to cheer me, and so it happened that I, in my turn, withdrew from the world, which had once been a bright and a happy world to me, and retired to end my days, peacefully, contentedly, and gratefully, as my brothers are ending theirs, in the solitude of the Glen Tower. How many years have passed since we have all three been united, it is not necessary to relate. It will be more to the purpose if I briefly record that we have never been separated since the day which first saw us assembled together in our hillside retreat, that we have never yet wearied of the time, of the place, or of ourselves, and that the influence of solitude on our hearts and minds has not altered them for the worse, for it has not embittered us toward our fellow creatures, and it has not dried up in us the sources from which harmless occupations and innocent pleasures may flow refreshingly to the last over the waste places of human life. Thus much for our own story, and for the circumstances which have withdrawn us from the world for the rest of our days. And now imagine us three lonely old men, tall and lean and white-headed, dressed, more from past habit than from present association, in customary suits of solemn black, Brother Owen, yielding, gentle and affectionate in look, voice and manner, Brother Morgan, with a quaint surface sourness of address, and a tone of dry sarcasm in his talk, which single him out, on all occasions, as a character in our little circle, Brother Griffith forming the link between his two elder companions, capable, at one time, of sympathizing with the quiet, thoughtful tone of Owen's conversation, and ready, at another, to exchange brisk severities on life and manners with Morgan. In short, a pliable, double-sided old lawyer who stands between the clergyman brother and the physician brother, with an ear ready for each, and with a heart open to both, share together. Imagine the strange old building in which we live to be really what its name implies. A tower standing in a glen, in past times the fortress of a fighting Welsh chieftain. In present times, a dreary land lighthouse, built up in many stories of 2 rooms each, with a little modern lean-to of cottage form tacked on quaintly to one of its sides. The great hill, on whose lowest slope it stands, rising precipitously behind it. A dark, swift-flowing stream in the valley below, hills on hills all round, and no way of approach but by one of the loneliest and wildest crossroads in all South Wales. Imagine such a place of abode as this, and such inhabitants of it as ourselves, and then picture the descent among us, as of a goddess dropping from the clouds of a lively, handsome, fashionable young lady. A bright, gay butterfly creature used to flutter away its existence in the broad sunshine of perpetual gaiety. A child of the new generation, with all the modern ideas whirling together in her pretty head, and all the modern accomplishments at the tips of her delicate fingers. Imagine such a light-hearted daughter of Eve as this, the spoiled darling of society, the charming spendthrift of nature's choicest treasures of beauty and youth, suddenly flashing into the dim life of 3 weary old men, suddenly dropped into the place, of all others, which is least fit for her, suddenly shut out from the world, in the lonely quiet of the loneliest home in England. Realize, if it be possible, all that is most whimsical and most anomalous in such a situation as this, and the startling confession contained in the opening sentence of these pages will no longer excite the faintest emotion of surprise. Who can wonder now, when our bright young goddess really descended on us, that I and my brothers were all 3 at our wits' end, what to do with her? Chapter 2. Our Dilemma. Who is the young lady, and how did she find her way into the Glen Tower? Her name, in relation to which I shall have something more to say a little further on, is Jessie Yelverton. She is an orphan and an only child. Her mother died while she was an infant. Her father was my dear and valued friend, Major Yelverton. He lived long enough to celebrate his darling's 7th birthday. When he died, he entrusted his authority over her and his responsibility toward her to his brother and to me. When I was summoned to the reading of the Major's will, I knew perfectly well that I should hear myself appointed guardian and executor with his brother, and I had been also made acquainted with my lost friend's wishes as to his daughter's education, and with his intentions as to the disposal of all his property in her favour. My own idea, therefore, was that the reading of the will would inform me of nothing which I had not known in the testator's lifetime. When the day came for hearing it, however, I found that I had been over-hasty in arriving at this conclusion. Toward the end of the document there was a clause inserted which took me entirely by surprise. After providing for the education of Miss Yelverton under the direction of her guardians, and for her residence, under ordinary circumstances, with the Major's sister, Lady Westwick, the clause concluded by saddling the child's future inheritance with this curious condition: from the period of her leaving school to the period of her reaching the age of 21 years, Miss Yelverton was to pass not less than 6 consecutive weeks out of every year under the roof of one of her 2 guardians. During the lives of both of them, it was left to her own choice to say which of the 2 she would prefer to live with. In all other respects, the condition was imperative. If she forfeited it, excepting, of course, the case of the deaths of both her guardians, she was only to have a life interest in the property. If she obeyed it, the money itself was to become her own possession on the day when she completed her 21st year. This clause in the will, as I have said, took me at first by surprise. I remembered how devotedly Lady Westwick had soothed her sister-in-law's deathbed sufferings, and how tenderly she had afterward watched over the welfare of the little motherless child. I remembered the innumerable claims she had established in this way on her brother's confidence in her affection for his orphan daughter, and I was therefore naturally amazed at the appearance of a condition in his will which seemed to show a positive distrust of Lady Westwick's undivided influence over the character and conduct of her niece. A few words from my fellow guardian, Mr. Richard Yelverton, and a little after consideration of some of my deceased friend's peculiarities of disposition and feeling, to which I had not hitherto attached sufficient importance, were enough to make me understand the motives by which he had been influenced in providing for the future of his child. Major Yelverton had raised himself to a position of affluence and eminence from a very humble origin. He was the son of a small farmer, and it was his pride never to forget this circumstance, never to be ashamed of it, and never to allow the prejudices of society to influence his own settled opinions on social questions in general. Acting, in all that related to his intercourse with the world, on such principles as these, the Major, it is hardly necessary to say, held some strangely heterodox opinions on the modern education of girls, and on the evil influence of society over the characters of women in general. Out of the strength of those opinions, and out of the certainty of his conviction that his sister did not share them, had grown that condition in his will which removed his daughter from the influence of her aunt for 6 consecutive weeks in every year. Lady Westwick was the most light-hearted, the most generous, the most impulsive of women, capable, when any serious occasion called it forth, of all that was devoted and self-sacrificing, but at other and ordinary times constitutionally restless, frivolous, and eager for perpetual gaiety. Distrusting the sort of life which he knew his daughter would lead under her aunt's roof, and at the same time gratefully remembering his sister's affectionate devotion toward his dying wife and her helpless infant, Major Yelverton had attempted to make a compromise, which, while it allowed Lady Westwick the close domestic intercourse with her niece that she had earned by innumerable kind offices, should, at the same time, place the young girl for a fixed period of every year of her minority under the corrective care of two such quiet, old-fashioned guardians as his brother and myself. Such is the history of the clause in the will. My friend little thought, when he dictated it, of the extraordinary result to which it was one day to lead. For some years, however, events ran on smoothly enough. Little Jessie was sent to an excellent school, with strict instructions to the mistress to make a good girl of her, and not a fashionable young lady. Although she was reported to be anything but a pattern pupil in respect of attention to her lessons, she became from the first the chosen favourite of everyone about her. The very offences which she committed against the discipline of the school were of the sort which provoke a smile even on the stern countenance of authority itself. One of these quaint freaks of mischief may not inappropriately be mentioned here, inasmuch as it gained her the pretty nickname under which she will be found to appear occasionally in these pages. On a certain autumn night, shortly after the midsummer vacation, the mistress of the school fancied she saw a light under the door of the bedroom occupied by Jessie and 3 other girls. It was then close on midnight, and, fearing that some case of sudden illness might have happened, she hastened into the room. On opening the door, she discovered, to her horror and amazement, that all 4 girls were out of bed, were dressed in brilliantly fantastic costumes, representing the 4 grotesque queens of hearts, diamonds, spades, and clubs, familiar to us all on the pack of cards, and were dancing a quadrille in which Jessie sustained the character of the Queen of Hearts. The next morning's investigation disclosed that Miss Yelverton had smuggled the dresses into the school, and had amused herself by giving an impromptu fancy ball to her companions, in imitation of an entertainment of the same kind at which she had figured in a court-card quadrille at her aunt's country house. The dresses were instantly confiscated, and the necessary punishment promptly administered. But the remembrance of Jessie's extraordinary outrage on bedroom discipline lasted long enough to become one of the traditions of the school, and she and her sister culprits were thenceforth hailed as the queens of the 4 suites by their class. Companions whenever the mistress's back was turned. Whatever might have become of the nicknames thus employed in relation to the other 3 girls, such a mock title as the Queen of Hearts was too appropriately descriptive of the natural charm of Jessie's character, as well as of the adventure in which she had taken the lead, not to rise naturally to the lips of everyone who knew her. It followed her to her aunt's house. It came to be as habitually and familiarly connected with her, among her friends of all ages, as if it had been formally inscribed on her baptismal register, and it has stolen its way into these pages because it falls from my pen naturally and inevitably, exactly as it often falls from my lips in real life. When Jessie left school, the first difficulty presented itself. In other words, the necessity arose of fulfilling the conditions of the will. At that time I was already settled at the Glen Tower, and her living 6 weeks in our dismal solitude and our humdrum society was, as she herself frankly wrote me word, quite out of the question. Fortunately, she had always got on well with her uncle and his family, so she exerted her liberty of choice, and, much to her own relief and to mine also, passed her regular 6 weeks of probation, year after year, under Mr. Richard Yelverton's roof. During this period I heard of her regularly, sometimes from my fellow guardian, sometimes from my son George, who, whenever his military duties allowed him the opportunity, contrived to see her, now at her aunt's house, and now at Mr. Yelverton's. The particulars of her character and conduct, which I gleaned in this way, more than sufficed to convince me that the poor Major's plan for the careful training of his daughter's disposition, though plausible enough in theory, was little better than a total failure in practice. Miss Jessie, to use the expressive common phrase, took after her aunt. She was as generous, as impulsive, as light-hearted, as fond of change and gaiety and fine clothes. In short, as complete and genuine a woman as Lady Westwick herself. It was impossible to reform the Queen of Hearts, and equally impossible not to love her. Such, in few words, was my fellow guardian's report of his experience of our handsome young ward. So the time passed till the year came of which I am now writing, the ever-memorable year, to England, of the Russian War. It happened that I had heard less than usual at this period, and indeed for many months before it, of Jessie and her proceedings. My son had been ordered out with his regiment to the Crimea in 1854, and had other work in hand now than recording the sayings and doings of a young lady. Mr. Richard Yelverton, who had been hitherto used to write to me with tolerable regularity, seemed now, for some reason that I could not conjecture, to have forgotten my existence. Ultimately I was reminded of my ward by one of George's own letters, in which he asked for news of her, and I wrote at once to Mr. Yelverton. The answer that reached me was written by his wife. He was dangerously ill. The next letter that came informed me of his death. This happened early in the spring of the year 1855. I am ashamed to confess it, but the change in my own position was the first idea that crossed my mind when I read the news of Mr. Yelverton's death. I was now left sole guardian, and Jessie Yelverton wanted a year still of coming of age. By the next day's post I wrote to her about the altered state of the relations between us. She was then on the continent with her aunt, having gone abroad at the very beginning of the year. Consequently, so far as 1855 was concerned, the condition exacted by the will yet remained to be performed. She had still 6 weeks to pass, her last 6 weeks seeing that she was now 20 years old, under the roof of one of her guardians, and I was now the only guardian left. In due course of time I received my answer, written on rose-coloured paper, and expressed throughout in a tone of light, easy, feminine banter, which amused me in spite of myself. Miss Jessie, according to her own account, was hesitating, on receipt of my letter, between two alternatives, the one of allowing herself to be buried 6 weeks in the Glen Tower, the other of breaking the condition, giving up the money, and remaining magnanimously contented with nothing but a life interest in her father's property. At present she inclined decidedly toward giving up the money and escaping the clutches of the 3 horrid old men, but she would let me know again if she happened to change her mind. And so, with best love, she would beg to remain always affectionately mine, as long as she was well out of my reach. The summer passed, the autumn came, and I never heard from her again. Under ordinary circumstances, this long silence might have made me feel a little uneasy. But news reached me about this time from the Crimea that my son was wounded, not dangerously, thank God, but still severely enough to be laid up, and all my anxieties were now centred in that direction. By the beginning of September, however, I got better accounts of him, and my mind was made easy enough to let me think of Jessie again. Just as I was considering the necessity of writing once more to my refractory ward, a second letter arrived from her. She had returned at last from abroad, had suddenly changed her mind, suddenly grown sick of society, suddenly become enamoured of the pleasures of retirement, and suddenly found out that the 3 horrid old men were 3 dear old men, and that 6 weeks' solitude at the Glen Tower was the luxury of all others, that she languished for most. As a necessary result of this altered state of things, she would therefore now propose to spend her allotted 6 weeks with her guardian. We might certainly expect her on the 20th of September, and she would take the greatest care to fit herself for our society by arriving in the lowest possible spirits, and bringing her own sackcloth and ashes along with her. The first ordeal to which this alarming letter forced me to submit was the breaking of the news it contained to my 2 brothers. The disclosure affected them very differently. Poor dear Owen merely turned pale, lifted his weak, thin hands in a panic-stricken manner, and then sat staring at me in speechless and motionless bewilderment. Morgan stood up straight before me, plunged both his hands into his pockets, burst suddenly into the harshest laugh I ever heard from his lips, and told me, with an air of triumph, that it was exactly what he expected. "What you expected?" I repeated in astonishment. "Yes," returned Morgan with his bitterest emphasis. "It doesn't surprise me in the least. It's the way things go in this world. It's the regular moral seesaw of good and evil, the old story with the old end to it. They were too happy in the Garden of Eden. Down comes the serpent and turns them out. Solomon was too wise. Down comes the Queen of Sheba and makes a fool of him. We've been too comfortable at the Glen Tower. Down comes a woman and sets us all 3 by the ears together. All I wonder at is that it hasn't happened before." With those words, Morgan resignedly took out his pipe, put on his old felt hat, and turned to the door. "You're not going away before she comes?" exclaimed Owen piteously. "Don't leave us. Please don't leave us." "Going," cried Morgan with great contempt. "What should I gain by that? When destiny has found a man out and heated his gridiron for him, he has nothing left to do, that I know of, but to get up and sit on it." I opened my lips to protest against the implied comparison between a young lady and a hot gridiron, but, before I could speak, Morgan was gone. "Well," I said to Owen, "we must make the best of it. We must brush up our manners, and set the house tidy, and amuse her as well as we can. The difficulty is where to put her, and, when that is settled, the next puzzle will be what to order in to make her comfortable. It's a hard thing, brother, to say what will, or what will not, please a young lady's taste." Owen looked absently at me, in greater bewilderment than ever, opened his eyes in perplexed consideration, repeated to himself slowly the word "tastes," and then helped me with this suggestion. "Hadn't we better begin, Griffith, by getting her a plum cake?" "My dear Owen," I remonstrated, "it is a grown young woman who is coming to see us, not a little girl from school." "Oh," said Owen, more confused than before. "Yes, I see, we couldn't do wrong, I suppose, could we, if we got her a little dog and a lot of new gowns?" There was, evidently, no more help in the way of advice to be expected from Owen than from Morgan himself. As I came to that conclusion, I saw through the window our old housekeeper on her way, with her basket, to the kitchen garden, and left the room to ascertain if she could assist us. To my great dismay, the housekeeper took even a more gloomy view than Morgan of the approaching event. When I had explained all the circumstances to her, she carefully put down her basket, crossed her arms, and said to me in slow, deliberate, mysterious tones, "You want my advice about what's to be done with this young woman. Well, sir, here's my advice. Don't you trouble your head about her. It won't be no use. Mind, I tell you, it won't be no use." "What do you mean? You look at this place, sir. It's more like a prison than a house, isn't it? You look at us as lives in it. We've got, saving your presence, a foot apiece in our graves, haven't we? When you was young yourself, sir, what would you have done if they had shut you up for 6 weeks in such a place as this, among your grandfathers and grandmothers, with their feet in the grave?" "I really can't say." "I can, sir. You'd have run away. She'll run away. Don't you worry your head about her. She'll save you the trouble. I tell you again, she'll run away." With those ominous words, the housekeeper took up her basket, sighed heavily, and left me. I sat down under a tree quite helpless. Here was the whole responsibility shifted upon my miserable shoulders. Not a lady in the neighbourhood to whom I could apply for assistance, and the nearest shop 8 miles distant from us. The toughest case I ever had to conduct, when I was at the bar, was plain sailing compared with the difficulty of receiving our fair guest. It was absolutely necessary, however, to decide at once where she was to sleep. All the rooms in the tower were of stone dark, gloomy and cold even in the summer-time. Impossible to put her in any one of them. The only other alternative was to lodge her in the little modern lean-to, which I have already described as being tacked on to the side of the old building. It contained 3 cottage rooms, and they might be made barely habitable for a young lady. But then those rooms were occupied by Morgan. His books were in one, his bed was in another, his pipes and general lumber were in the third. Could I expect him, after the sour similitudes he had used in reference to our expected visitor, to turn out of his habitation and disarrange all his habits for her convenience? The bare idea of proposing the thing to him seemed ridiculous, and yet inexorable necessity left me no choice but to make the hopeless experiment. I walked back to the tower hastily and desperately to face the worst that might happen before my courage cooled altogether. On crossing the threshold of the hall door, I was stopped, to my great amazement, by a procession of 3 of the farm servants, followed by Morgan, all walking after each other, in Indian file, toward the spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The first of the servants carried the materials for making a fire, the second bore an inverted armchair on his head, the third tottered under a heavy load of books, while Morgan came last, with his canister of tobacco in his hand, his dressing-gown over his shoulders, and his whole collection of pipes hugged up together in a bundle under his arm. "What on earth does this mean?" I inquired. "It means taking time by the forelock," answered Morgan, looking at me with a smile of sour satisfaction. "I've got the start of your young woman, Griffith, and I'm making the most of it." "But where, in heaven's name, are you going?" I asked, as the head man of the procession disappeared with his firing up the staircase. "How high is this tower?" retorted Morgan. 7 stories, to be sure," I replied. "Very good," said my eccentric brother, setting his foot on the first stair. "I'm going up to the 7th. "You can't," I shouted. "She can't, you mean," said Morgan, "and that's exactly why I'm going there. But the room is not furnished. It's out of her reach. One of the windows has fallen to pieces. It's out of her reach. There's a crow's nest in the corner. It's out of her reach." By the time this unanswerable argument had attained its 3rd repetition, Morgan, in his turn, had disappeared up the winding stairs. I knew him too well to attempt any further protest. Here was my first difficulty smoothed away most unexpectedly, for here were the rooms in the lean-to placed by their owner's free act and deed at my disposal. I wrote on the spot to the one upholsterer of our distant county town to come immediately and survey the premises, and sent off a mounted messenger with the letter. This done, and the necessary order also dispatched to the carpenter and glazier to set them at work on Morgan's sky parlour in the 7th story, I began to feel, for the first time, as if my scattered wits were coming back to me. By the time the evening had closed in, I had hit on no less than 3 excellent ideas, all providing for the future comfort and amusement of our fair guest. The first idea was to get her a Welsh pony, the second was to hire a piano from the county town, the third was to send for a boxful of novels from London. I must confess I thought these projects for pleasing her very happily conceived, and Owen agreed with me. Morgan, as usual, took the opposite view. He said she would yawn over the novels, turn up her nose at the piano, and fracture her skull with the pony. As for the housekeeper, she stuck to her text as stoutly in the evening as she had stuck to it in the morning. Piano or no piano, storybook or no storybook, pony or no pony, you mark my words, sir, that young woman will run away. Such were the housekeeper's parting words when she wished me good night. When the next morning came, and brought with it that terrible waking time which sets a man's hopes and projects before him, the great as well as the small stripped bare of every illusion, it is not to be concealed that I felt less sanguine of our success in entertaining the coming guest. So far as external preparations were concerned, there seemed, indeed, but little to improve, but apart from these, what had we to offer, in ourselves and our society, to attract her? There lay the knotty point of the question, and there the grand difficulty of finding an answer. I fall into serious reflection while I am dressing on the pursuits and occupations with which we 3 brothers have been accustomed, for years past, to beguile the time. Are they at all likely, in the case of any one of us, to interest or amuse her? My chief occupation, to begin with the youngest, consists in acting as steward on Owen's property. The routine of my duties has never lost its sober attraction to my tastes, for it has always employed me in watching the best interests of my brother and of my son also, who is one day to be his heir. But can I expect our fair guest to sympathize with such family concerns as these? Clearly not. Morgan's pursuit comes next in order of review, a pursuit of a far more ambitious nature than mine. It was always part of my second brother's whimsical, self-contradictory character to view with the profoundest contempt the learned profession by which he gained his livelihood, and he is now occupying the long leisure hours of his old age in composing a voluminous treatise, intended one of these days to eject the whole body corporate of doctors from the position which they have usurped in the estimation of their fellow creatures. This daring work is entitled An Examination of the Claims of Medicine on the Gratitude of Mankind, decided in the negative by a retired physician. So far as I can tell, the book is likely to extend to the dimensions of an encyclopedia, for it is Morgan's plan to treat his comprehensive subject principally from the historical point of view, and to run down all the doctors of antiquity, one after another, in regular succession, from the first of the tribe. When I last heard of his progress, he was hard on the heels of Hippocrates, but had no immediate prospect of tripping up his successor. Is this the sort of occupation, I asked myself, in which a modern young lady is likely to feel the slightest interest? Once again, clearly not. Owen's favourite employment is, in its way, quite as characteristic as Morgan's, and it has the great additional advantage of appealing to a much larger variety of tastes. My eldest brother, great at drawing and painting when he was a lad, always interested in artists and their works in afterlife, has resumed, in his declining years, the holiday occupation of his schoolboy days. As an amateur landscape painter, he works with more satisfaction to himself, uses more colour, wears out more brushes, and makes a greater smell of paint in his studio than any artist by profession, native or foreign, whom I ever met with. In look, in manner, and in disposition, the gentlest of mankind, Owen, by some singular anomaly in his character, which he seems to have caught from Morgan, glories placidly in the wildest and most frightful range of subjects which his art is capable of representing. Immeasurable ruins, in howling wildernesses, with blood-red sunsets gleaming over them, thunderclouds rent with lightning, hovering over splitting trees on the verges of awful precipices, hurricanes, shipwrecks, waves, and whirlpools follow each other on his canvas, without an intervening glimpse of quiet everyday nature to relieve the succession of pictorial horrors. When I see him at his easel, so neat and quiet, so unpretending and modest in himself, with such a composed expression on his attentive face, with such a weak white hand to guide such bold, big brushes, and when I look at the frightful canvasful of terrors which he is serenely aggravating in fierceness and intensity with every successive touch, I find it difficult to realize the connection between my brother and his work, though I see them before me not 6 inches apart. Will this quaint spectacle possess any humorous attractions for Miss Jessie? Perhaps it may. There is some slight chance that Owen's employment will be lucky enough to interest her. Thus far my morning cogitations advance doubtfully enough, but they altogether fail in carrying me beyond the narrow circle of the Glen Tower. I try hard, in our visitor's interest, to look into the resources of the little world around us, and I find my efforts rewarded by the prospect of a total blank. Is there any presentable living soul in the neighbourhood whom we can invite to meet her? Not one. There are, as I have already said, no country seats near us, and society in the county town has long since learned to regard us as 3 misanthropes, strongly suspected, from our monastic way of life and our dismal black costume, of being popish priests in disguise. In other parts of England the clergyman of the parish might help us out of our difficulty, but here in South Wales, and in this latter half of the 19th century, we have the old-type parson of the days of Fielding still in a state of perfect preservation. Our local clergyman receives a stipend which is too paltry to bear comparison with the wages of an ordinary mechanic. In dress, manners, and tastes he is about on a level with the upper class of agricultural labourer. When attempts have been made by well-meaning gentlefolks to recognize the claims of his profession by asking him to their houses, he has been known, on more than one occasion, to leave his ploughman's pair of shoes in the hall and enter the drawing-room respectfully in his stockings. Where he preaches, miles and miles away from us, and from the poor cottage in which he lives, if he sees any of the company in the squire's pew yawn or fidget in their places, he takes it as a hint that they are tired of listening, and closes his sermon instantly at the end of the sentence. Can we ask this most irreverend and unclerical of men to meet a young lady? I doubt, even if we made the attempt, whether we should succeed by fair means in getting him beyond the servants' hall. Dismissing, therefore, all idea of inviting visitors to entertain our guest, and feeling, at the same time, more than doubtful of her chance of discovering any attraction in the sober society of the inmates of the house, I finish my dressing and go down to breakfast, secretly veering round to the housekeeper's opinion that Miss Jessie will really bring matters to an abrupt conclusion by running away. I find Morgan as bitterly resigned to his destiny as ever, and Owen so affectionately anxious to make himself of some use, and so lamentably ignorant of how to begin, that I am driven to disembarrass myself of him at the outset by a stratagem. I suggest to him that our visitor is sure to be interested in pictures, and that it would be a pretty attention on his part to paint her a landscape to hang up in her room. Owen brightens directly, informs me in his softest tones that he is then at work on the earthquake at Lisbon, and inquires whether I think she would like that subject. I preserve my gravity sufficiently to answer in the affirmative, and my brother retires meekly to his studio to depict the engulfing of a city and the destruction of a population. Morgan withdraws in his turn to the top of the tower, threatening, when our guest comes, to draw all his meals up to his new residence by means of a basket and string. I am left alone for an hour, and then the upholsterer arrives from the county town. This worthy man, on being informed of our emergency, sees his way, apparently, to a good stroke of business, and thereupon wins my lasting gratitude by taking, in opposition to everyone else, a bright and hopeful view of existing circumstances. "You'll excuse me, sir," he says confidentially when I show him the rooms in the lean-to, "but this is a matter of experience. I'm a family man myself, with grown-up daughters of my own, and the natures of young women are well known to me. Make their rooms comfortable, and you make 'em happy. Surround their lives, sir, with a suitable atmosphere of furniture, and you never hear a word of complaint drop from their lips. Now, with regard to these rooms, for example, sir, you put a neat French bedstead in that corner, with curtains conformable, say a tasty chintz. You put on that bedstead what I will term a sufficiency of bedding, and you top up with a sweet little eider-down quilt, as light as roses, and similar the same in colour. You do that, and what follows? You please her eye when she lies down at night, and you please her eye when she gets up in the morning. And you're all right so far, and so is she. I will not dwell, sir, on the toilet table, nor will I seek to detain you about the glass to show her figure, and the other glass to show her face, because I have the articles in stock, and will be myself answerable for their effect on a lady's mind and person. He led the way into the next room as he spoke, and arranged its future fittings and decorations as he had already planned out the bedroom, with the strictest reference to the connection which experience had shown him to exist between comfortable furniture and female happiness. Thus far, in my helpless state of mind, the man's confidence had impressed me in spite of myself, and I had listened to him in superstitious silence. But as he continued to rise, by regular gradations, from one climax of upholstery to another, warning visions of his bill disclosed themselves in the remote background of the scene of luxury and magnificence which my friend was conjuring up. Certain sharp professional instincts of bygone times resumed their influence over me. I began to start doubts and ask questions, and, as a necessary consequence, the interview between us soon assumed something like a practical form. Having ascertained what the probable expense of furnishing would amount to, and having discovered that the process of transforming the lean-to, allowing for the time required to procure certain articles of rarity from Bristol, would occupy nearly a fortnight, I dismissed the upholsterer with the understanding that I should take a day or two for consideration, and let him know the result. It was then the 5th of September, and our Queen of Hearts was to arrive on the 20th. The work, therefore, if it was begun on the 7th or 8th, would be begun in time. In making all my calculations with a reference to the 20th of September, I relied implicitly, it will be observed, on a young lady's punctuality in keeping an appointment which she had herself made. I can only account for such extraordinary simplicity, on my part, on the supposition that my wits had become sadly rusted by long seclusion from society. Whether it was referable to this cause or not, my innocent trustfulness was at any rate destined to be practically rebuked before long in the most surprising manner. Little did I suspect, when I parted from the upholsterer on the 5th of the month, what the 10th of the month had in store for me. On the 7th, I made up my mind to have the bedroom furnished at once, and to postpone the question of the sitting-room for a few days longer. Having dispatched the necessary order to that effect, I next wrote to hire the piano and to order the box of novels. This done, I congratulated myself on the forward state of the preparations, and sat down to repose in the atmosphere of my own happy delusions. On the 9th the waggon arrived with the furniture, and the men set to work on the bedroom. From this moment Morgan retired definitely to the top of the tower, and Owen became too nervous to lay the necessary amount of paint on the earthquake at Lisbon. On the 10th, the work was proceeding bravely. Toward noon, Owen and I strolled to the door to enjoy the fine autumn sunshine. We were sitting lazily on our favourite bench in front of the tower, when we were startled by a shout from above us. Looking up directly, we saw Morgan half in and half out of his narrow window, in the 7th story, gesticulating violently with the stem of his long meerschaum pipe in the direction of the road below us. We gazed eagerly in the quarter thus indicated, but our low position prevented us for some time from seeing anything. At last we both discerned an old yellow post-chaise distinctly and indisputably approaching us. Owen and I looked at one another in panic-stricken silence, It was coming to us, and what did it contain? Do pianos travel in chaises? Are boxes of novels conveyed to their destination by a postilion? We expected the piano and expected the novels, but nothing else. Unquestionably, nothing else. The chaise took the turn in the road, passed through the gateless gap in our rough enclosure wall of loose stone, and rapidly approached us. A bonnet appeared at the window, and a hand gaily waved a white handkerchief. Powers of caprice, confusion, and dismay. It was Jessie Yelverton herself arriving, without a word of warning, exactly 10 days before her time. Or, Chapter 3, Our Queen of Hearts. The chaise stopped in front of us, and before we had recovered from our bewilderment, the gardener had opened the door and let down the steps. A bright, laughing face, prettily framed round by a black veil passed over the head and tied under the chin. A travelling dress of a nankeen colour, studded with blue buttons and trimmed with white braid, a light brown cloak over it, little, neatly gloved hands, which seized in an instant on one of mine and on one of Owen's, 2 dark blue eyes, which seemed to look us both through and through in a moment, a clear, full, merrily confident voice, a look and manner gaily and gracefully self-possessed. Such were the characteristics of our fair guest, which first struck me at the moment when she left the post-chaise and possessed herself of my hand. "Don't begin by scolding me," she said, before I could utter a word of welcome. "There will be time enough for that in the course of the next 6 weeks. I beg pardon, with all possible humility, for the offence of coming 10 days before my time. Don't ask me to account for it, please. If you do, I shall be obliged to confess the truth. My dear sir, the fact is, this is an act of impulse." She paused and looked us both in the face with a bright confidence in her own flow of nonsense that was perfectly irresistible. "I must tell you all about it," she ran on, leading the way to the bench and inviting us, by a little mock gesture of supplication, to seat ourselves on either side of her. "I feel so guilty till I've told you. Dear me, how nice this is. Here I am quite at home already. Isn't it odd? Well, and how do you think it happened? The morning before yesterday, Matilda. There is Matilda, picking up my bonnet from the bottom of that remarkably musty carriage. Matilda came and woke me as usual, and I hadn't an idea in my head, I assure you, till she began to brush my hair. Can you account for it? I can't, but she seemed, somehow, to brush a sudden fancy for coming here into my head. When I went down to breakfast, I said to my aunt, "Darling, I have an irresistible impulse to go to Wales at once, instead of waiting till the 20th. She made all the necessary objections, poor dear, and my impulse got stronger and stronger with every one of them. "I'm quite certain," I said, "I shall never go at all if I don't go now." "In that case," says my aunt, "ring the bell and have your trunks packed. Your whole future depends on your going, and you terrify me so inexpressibly that I shall be glad to get rid of you. You may not think it, to look at her, but Matilda is a treasure, and in 3 hours more I was on the Great Western Railway. I have not the least idea how I got here, except that the men helped me everywhere. They are always such delightful creatures. I have been casting myself and my maid and my trunks on their tender mercies at every point in the journey, and their polite attentions exceed all belief. I slept at your horrid little county town last night, and the night before I missed a steamer or a train, I forget which, and slept at Bristol, and that's how I got here. And, now I am here, I ought to give my guardian a kiss, oughtn't I? Shall I call you Papa? I think I will. And shall I call you Uncle, sir, and give you a kiss too? We shall come to it sooner or later, shan't we? And we may as well begin at once, I suppose." Her fresh young lips touched my old withered cheek first, and then Owen's, a soft, momentary shadow of tenderness that was very pretty and becoming, passing quickly over the sunshine and gaiety of her face as she saluted us. The next moment she was on her feet again, inquiring who the wonderful man was who built the Glen Tower, and wanting to go all over it immediately from top to bottom. As we took her into the house, I made the necessary apologies for the miserable condition of the lean-to, and assured her that 10 days later she would have found it perfectly ready to receive her. She whisked into the rooms, looked all round them, whisked out again, declared she had come to live in the old tower, and not in any modern addition to it, and flatly declined to inhabit the lean-to on any terms whatever. I opened my lips to state certain objections, but she slicked away in an instant and made straight for the tower staircase. "Who lives here?" she asked, calling down to us eagerly from the first-floor landing. "I do," said Owen, "but if you would like me to move out—" She was away up the second flight before he could say any more. The next sound we heard as we slowly followed her was a peremptory drumming against the room door of the second story. "Anybody here?" we heard her ask through the door. I called up to her that, under ordinary circumstances, I was there, but that, like Owen, I should be happy to move out. My polite offer was cut short, as my brother's had been. We heard more drumming at the door of the third story. There were 2 rooms here also, one perfectly empty, the other stocked with odds and ends of dismal, old-fashioned furniture for which we had no use, and grimly ornamented by a life-size basket figure supporting a complete suit of armour in a sadly rusty condition. When Owen and I got to the third-floor landing, the door was open. Miss Jessie had taken possession of the rooms, and we found her on a chair, dusting the man in armour with her cambric pocket-handkerchief. "I shall live here," she said, looking round at us briskly over her shoulder. We both remonstrated, but it was quite in vain. She told us that she had an impulse to live with the man in armour, and that she would have her way, or go back immediately in the post-chaise, which we pleased. Finding it impossible to move her, we bargained that she should, at least, allow the new bed and the rest of the comfortable furniture in the lean-to to be moved up into the empty room for her sleeping accommodation. She consented to this condition, protesting, however, to the last against being compelled to sleep in a bed, because it was a modern conventionality, out of all harmony with her place of residence and her friend in armour. Fortunately for the repose of Morgan, who, under other circumstances, would have discovered on the very first day that his airy retreat was by no means high enough to place him out of Jessie's reach, the idea of settling herself instantly in her new habitation excluded every other idea from the mind of our fair guest. She pinned up the nankeen-coloured travelling dress in festoons all round her on the spot, informed us that we were now about to make acquaintance with her in the new character of a woman of business, and darted downstairs in mad high spirits, screaming for Matilda and the trunks like a child for a set of new toys. The wholesome protest of nature against the artificial restraints of modern life expressed itself in all that she said and in all that she did. She had never known what it was to be happy before, because she had never been allowed, until now, to do anything for herself. She was down on her knees at one moment, blowing the fire, and telling us that she felt like Cinderella. She was up on a table the next, attacking the cobwebs with a long broom, and wishing she had been born a housemaid. As for my unfortunate friend, the upholsterer, he was levelled to the ranks at the first effort he made to assume the command of the domestic forces in the furniture department. She laughed at him, pushed him about, disputed all his conclusions, altered all his arrangements, and ended by ordering half his bedroom furniture to be taken back again, for the one unanswerable reason that she meant to do without it. As evening approached, the scene presented by the 2 rooms became eccentric to a pitch of absurdity which is quite indescribable. The grim, ancient walls of the bedroom had the liveliest modern dressing-gowns and morning wrappers hanging all about them. The man in armour had a collection of smart little boots and shoes dangling by laces and ribbons round his iron legs. A worm-eaten, steel-clasped casket, dragged out of a corner, frowned on the upholsterer's brand-new toilet table and held a miscellaneous assortment of combs, hairpins and brushes. Here stood a gloomy antique chair, the patriarch of its tribe, whose arms of blackened oak embraced a pair of pert, New Deal bonnet boxes, not a fortnight old. There, thrown down lightly on a rugged tapestry table cover, the long labour of centuries past, lay the brief, delicate work of a week ago, in the shape of silk and muslin dresses turned inside out. In the midst of all these confusions and contradictions, Miss Jessie ranged to and fro, the active centre of the whole scene of disorder, now singing at the top of her voice, and now declaring in her light-hearted way that one of us must make up his mind to marry her immediately, as she was determined to settle for the rest of her life at the Glen Tower. She followed up that announcement, when we met at dinner, by inquiring if we quite understood by this time that she had left her company manners in London, and that she meant to govern us all at her absolute will and pleasure throughout the whole period of her stay. Having thus provided at the outset for the due recognition of her authority by the household, generally and individually, Having briskly planned out all her own forthcoming occupations and amusements over the wine and fruit at dessert, and having positively settled, between her first and second cups of tea, where our connection with them was to begin and where it was to end, she had actually succeeded, when the time came to separate for the night, in setting us as much at our ease, and in making herself as completely a necessary part of our household as if she had lived among us for years and years past. Such was our first day's experience of the formidable guest whose anticipated visit had so sorely and so absurdly discomposed us all. I could hardly believe that I had actually wasted hours of precious time in worrying myself and everybody else in the house about the best means of laboriously entertaining a lively, high-spirited girl who was perfectly capable, without an effort on her own part or on ours, of entertaining herself. Having upset every one of our calculations on the first day of her arrival, she next falsified all our predictions before she had been with us a week. Instead of fracturing her skull with the pony, as Morgan had prophesied, she sat the sturdy, sure-footed, mischievous little brute as if she were part and parcel of himself. With an old waterproof cloak of mine on her shoulders, with a broad-flapped Spanish hat of Owen's on her head, with a wild imp of a Welsh boy following her as guide and groom on a bare-backed pony, and with one of the largest and ugliest cur-dogs in England, which she had picked up, lost and starved by the wayside, barking at her heels, she scoured the country in all directions, and came back to dinner, as she herself expressed it, with the manners of an Amazon, the complexion of a dairymaid, and the appetite of a wolf. On days when incessant rain kept her indoors, she amused herself with a new freak. Making friends everywhere, as became the Queen of Hearts, she even ingratiated herself with the sour old housekeeper, who had predicted so obstinately that she was certain to run away. To the amazement of everybody in the house, she spent hours in the kitchen, learning to make puddings and pies, and trying all sorts of recipes with very varying success, from an antiquated cookery book which she had discovered at the back of my bookshelves. At other times, when I expected her to be upstairs, languidly examining her finery and idly polishing her trinkets, I heard of her in the stables, feeding the rabbits, and talking to the raven, or found her in the conservatory, fumigating the plants, and half suffocating the gardener, who was trying to moderate her enthusiasm in the production of smoke. Instead of finding amusement, as we had expected, in Owen's studio, she puckered up her pretty face in grimaces of disgust at the smell of paint in the room, and declared that the horrors of the earthquake at Lisbon made her feel hysterical. Instead of showing a total want of interest in my business occupations on the estate, she destroyed my dignity as steward by joining me in my rounds on her pony, with her vagabond retinue at her heels. Instead of devouring the novels I had ordered for her, she left them in the box, and put her feet on it when she felt sleepy after a hard day's riding. Instead of practicing for hours every evening at the piano, which I had hired with such a firm conviction of her using it, she showed us tricks on the cards, taught us new games, initiated us into the mystics of dominoes, challenged us with riddles, and even attempted to stimulate us into acting charades. In short, tried every evening amusement in the whole category except the amusement of music. Every new aspect of her character was a new surprise to us, and every fresh occupation that she chose was a fresh contradiction to our previous expectations. The value of experience as a guide is unquestionable in many of the most important affairs of life, but, speaking for myself personally, I never understood the utter futility of it, where a woman is concerned, until I was brought into habits of daily communication with our fair guest. In her domestic relations with ourselves, she showed that exquisite nicety of discrimination in studying our characters, habits, and tastes which comes by instinct with women, and which even the longest practice rarely teaches in similar perfection to men. She saw, at a glance, all the underlying tenderness and generosity concealed beneath Owen's external shyness, irresolution, and occasional reserve, and, from first to last, even in her gayest moments, there was always a certain quietly implied consideration, an easy, graceful, delicate deference in her manner toward my eldest brother, which won upon me and upon him every hour in the day. With me she was freer in her talk, quicker in her actions, readier and bolder in all the 1,000 little familiarities of our daily intercourse. When we met in the morning she always took Owen's hand and waited till he kissed her on the forehead. In my case, she put both her hands on my shoulders, raised herself on tiptoe, and saluted me briskly on both cheeks in the foreign way. She never differed in opinion with Owen without propitiating him first by some little artful compliment in the way of excuse. She argued boldly with me on every subject under the sun, law and politics included, and, when I got the better of her, never hesitated to stop me by putting her hand on my lips or by dragging me out into the garden in the middle of a sentence. As for Morgan, she abandoned all restraint in his case on the second day of her sojourn among us. She had asked after him as soon as she was settled in her 2 rooms on the 3rd story, had insisted on knowing why he lived at the top of the tower, and why he had not appeared to welcome her at the door, had entrapped us into all sorts of damaging admissions, and had thereupon discovered the true state of the case in less than 5 minutes. From that time my unfortunate second brother became the victim of all that was mischievous and reckless in her disposition. She forced him downstairs by a series of manoeuvres which rendered his refuge uninhabitable, and then pretended to fall violently in love with him. She slipped little pink 3-cornered notes under his door, entreating him to make appointments with her, or tenderly inquiring how he would like to see her hair dressed at dinner on that day. She followed him into the garden, sometimes to ask for the privilege of smelling his tobacco smoke, sometimes to beg for a lock of his hair, or a fragment of his ragged old dressing-gown, to put among her keepsakes. She sighed at him when he was in a passion, and put her handkerchief to her eyes when he was sulky. In short, she tormented Morgan whenever she could catch him, with such ingenious and such relentless malice that he actually threatened to go back to London and prey once more, in the unscrupulous character of a doctor, on the credulity of mankind. Thus situated in her relations toward ourselves, and thus occupied by country diversions of her own choosing, Miss Jessie passed her time at the Glen Tower, excepting now and then a dull hour in the long evenings, to her guardian's satisfaction, and, all things considered, not without pleasure to herself. Day followed day in calm and smooth succession, and 5 quiet weeks had elapsed out of the 6, during which her stay was to last without any remarkable occurrence to distinguish them, when an event happened which personally affected me in a very serious manner, and which suddenly caused our handsome Queen of Hearts to become the object of my deepest anxiety in the present, and of my dearest hopes for the future. Chapter 4. Our Grand Project. At the end of the 5th week of our guest's stay, among the letters which the morning's post brought to the Glen Tower, there was one for me, from my son George, in the Crimea. The effect which this letter produced in our little circle renders it necessary that I should present it here, to speak for itself. This is what I read alone in my own room. My dearest father, after the great public news of the fall of Sebastopol, have you any ears left for small items of private intelligence from insignificant subaltern officers? Prepare, if you have, for a sudden and a startling announcement. How shall I write the words? How shall I tell you that I am really coming home? I have a private opportunity of sending this letter, and only a short time to write it in, so I must put many things, if I can, into few words. The doctor has reported me fit to travel at last, and I leave, thanks to the privilege of a wounded man, by the next ship. The name of the vessel and the time of starting are on the list which I enclose. I have made all my calculations, and, allowing for every possible delay, I find that I shall be with you, at the latest, on the 1st of November, perhaps some days earlier. I am far too full of my return, and of something else connected with it which is equally dear to me, to say anything about public affairs, more especially as I know that the newspapers must, by this time, have given you plenty of information. Let me fill the rest of this paper with a subject which is very near to my heart, nearer, I am almost ashamed to say, than the great triumph of my countrymen, in which my disabled condition has prevented me from taking any share. I gathered from your last letter that Miss Yelverton was to pay you a visit this autumn, in your capacity of her guardian. If she is already with you, pray move heaven and earth to keep her at the Glen Tower till I come back. Do you anticipate my confession from this entreaty? My dear, dear father, all my hopes rest on that one darling treasure which you are guarding, perhaps, at this moment, under your own roof. All my happiness depends on making Jessie Yelverton my wife. If I did not sincerely believe that you will heartily approve of my choice, I should hardly have ventured on this abrupt confession. Now that I have made it, let me go on and tell you why I have kept my attachment up to this time a secret from everyone, even from Jessie herself. You see, I call her by her Christian name already. I should have risked everything, father, and have laid my whole heart open before her more than a year ago, but for the order which sent our regiment out to take its share in this great struggle of the Russian war. No ordinary change in my life would have silenced me on the subject of all others of which I was most anxious to speak, but this change made me think seriously of the future, and out of those thoughts came the resolution which I have kept until this time. For her sake, and for her sake only, I constrained myself to leave the words unspoken which might have made her my promised wife. I resolved to spare her the dreadful suspense of waiting for her betrothed husband till the perils of war might, or might not, give him back to her. I resolved to save her from the bitter grief of my death if a bullet laid me low. I resolved to preserve her from the wretched sacrifice of herself if I came back, as many a brave man will come back from this war, invalided for life. Leaving her untrammelled by any engagement, unsuspicious perhaps of my real feelings toward her, I might die, and know that, by keeping silence, I had spared a pang to the heart that was dearest to me. This was the thought that stayed the words on my lips when I left England, uncertain whether I should ever come back. If I had loved her less dearly, if her happiness had been less precious to me, I might have given way under the hard restraint I imposed on myself, and might have spoken selfishly at the last moment. And now the time of trial is past, the war is over, and, although I still walk a little lame, I am, thank God, in as good health and in much better spirits than when I left home. Oh, father, if I should lose her now, if I should get no reward for sparing her but the bitterest of all disappointments! Sometimes I am vain enough to think that I made some little impression on her. Sometimes I doubt if she has a suspicion of my love. She lives in a gay world. She is the centre of perpetual admiration. Men with all the qualities to win a woman's heart are perpetually about her. Dare I hope? Yes, I must. Only keep her, I entreat you, at the Glen Tower. In that quiet world, in that freedom from frivolities and temptations, she will listen to me as she might listen nowhere else. Keep her, my dearest, kindest father, and, above all things, breathe not a word to her of this letter. I have surely earned the privilege of being the first to open her eyes to the truth. She must know nothing, now that I am coming home, till she knows all from my own lips. Here the writing hurriedly broke off. I am only giving myself credit for common feeling, I trust, when I confess that what I read deeply affected me. I think I never felt so fond of my boy, and so proud of him, as at the moment when I laid down his letter. As soon as I could control my spirits, I began to calculate the question of time with a trembling eagerness, which brought back to my mind my own young days of love and hope. My son was to come back, at the latest, on the 1st of November, and Jessie's allotted 6 weeks would expire on the 22nd of October. 10 days too soon. But for the caprice which had brought her to us exactly that number of days before her time, she would have been in the house, as a matter of necessity, on George's return. I searched back in my memory for a conversation that I had held with her a week since on her future plans. Toward the middle of November, her aunt, Lady Westwick, had arranged to go to her house in Paris, and Jessie was, of course, to accompany her into that very circle of the best English and the best French society, which contained in it the elements most adverse to George's hopes. Between this time and that, she had no special engagement, and she had only settled to write and warn her aunt of her return to London a day or two before she left the Glen Tower. Under these circumstances, the all-important necessity was to prevail on her to prolong her stay beyond the allotted 6 weeks by 10 days. After the caution to be silent impressed on me, and most naturally, poor boy, in George's letter, I felt that I could only appeal to her on the ordinary ground of hospitality. Would this be sufficient to effect the object? I was sure that the hours of the morning and the afternoon had, thus far, been fully and happily occupied by her various amusements, indoors and out. She was no more weary of her days now than she had been when she first came among us. But I was by no means so certain that she was not tired of her evenings. I had latterly noticed symptoms of weariness after the lamps were lit, and a suspicious regularity in retiring to bed the moment the clock struck 10. If I could provide her with a new amusement for the long evenings, I might leave the days to take care of themselves, and might then make sure, seeing that she had no special engagement in London until the middle of November, of her being sincerely thankful and ready to prolong her stay. How was this to be done? The piano and the novels had both failed to attract her. What other amusement was there to offer? It was useless at present to ask myself such questions as these. I was too much agitated to think collectedly on the most trifling subjects. I was even too restless to stay in my own room. My son's letter had given me so fresh an interest in Jessie that I was now as impatient to see her as if we were about to meet for the first time. I wanted to look at her with my new eyes, to listen to her with my new ears, to study her secretly with my new purposes and my new hopes and fears. To my dismay, for I wanted the very weather itself to favour George's interests, it was raining heavily that morning. I knew, therefore, that I should probably find her in her own sitting-room. When I knocked at her door, with George's letter crumpled up in my hand, with George's hopes in full possession of my heart, it is no exaggeration to say that my nerves were almost as much fluttered, and my ideas almost as much confused, as they were on a certain memorable day in the far past, when I rose, in brand-new wig and gown, to set my future prospects at the bar on the hazard of my first speech. When I entered the room, I found Jessie leaning back languidly in her largest armchair, watching the raindrops dripping down the window-pane. The unfortunate box of novels was open by her side, and the books were lying, for the most part, strewed about on the ground at her feet. One volume lay open, back upward, on her lap, and her hands were crossed over it listlessly. To my great dismay, she was yawning, palpably and widely yawning, when I came in. No sooner did I find myself in her presence than an irresistible anxiety to make some secret discovery of the real state of her feelings toward George took possession of me. After the customary condolences on the imprisonment to which she was subjected by the weather, I said, in as careless a manner as it was possible to assume, "I have heard from my son this morning. He talks of being ordered home, and tells me I may expect to see him before the end of the year." I was too cautious to mention the exact date of his return, for in that case she might have detected my motive for asking her to prolong her visit. "Oh, indeed," she said. How very nice. How glad you must be." I watched her narrowly. The clear, dark blue eyes met mine as openly as ever. The smooth, round cheeks kept their fresh colour quite unchanged. The full, good-humoured, smiling lips never trembled or altered their expression in the slightest degree. Her light-checked silk dress, with its pretty trimming of cherry-coloured ribbon, lay quite still over the bosom beneath it. For all the information I could get from her look and manner, we might as well have been 100 miles apart from each other. Is the best woman in the world little better than a fathomless abyss of duplicity on certain occasions, and where certain feelings of her own are concerned? I would rather not think that, and yet I don't know how to account otherwise for the masterly manner in which Miss Jessie contrived to baffle me. I was afraid, literally afraid, to broach the subject of prolonging her sojourn with us on a rainy day, so I changed the topic, in despair, to the novels that were scattered about her. "Can you find nothing there," I asked, "to amuse you this wet morning?" "There are 2 or 3 good novels," she said carelessly, "but I read them before I left London." "And the others won't even do for a dull day in the country?" I went on. "They might do for some people," she answered, "but not for me. I'm rather peculiar, perhaps, in my tastes. I'm sick to death of novels with an earnest purpose. I'm sick to death of outbursts of eloquence, and large-minded philanthropy, and graphic descriptions, and unsparing anatomy of the human heart, and all that sort of thing. Good gracious me! Isn't it the original intention or purpose, or whatever you call it, of a work of fiction, to set out distinctly by telling a story? And how many of these books, I should like to know, do that? Why, so far as telling a story is concerned, the greater part of them might as well be sermons as novels. Oh, dear me, what I want is something that seizes hold of my interest, and makes me forget when it is time to dress for dinner, something that keeps me reading, in a breathless state to find out the end. You know what I mean, at least you ought. Why, there was that little chance story you told me yesterday in the garden, don't you remember, about your strange client whom you never saw again. I declare it was much more interesting than half these novels, because it was a story. Tell me another about your young days, when you were seeing the world and meeting with all sorts of remarkable people. Or, no, don't tell it now. Keep it till the evening, when we all want something to stir us up. You old people might amuse us young ones out of your own resources oftener than you do. It was very kind of you to get me these books, but, with all respect to them, I would rather have the rummaging of your memory than the rummaging of this box. What's the matter? Are you afraid I have found out the window in your bosom already? I had half risen from my chair at her last words, and I felt that my face must have flushed at the same moment. She had started an idea in my mind, the very idea of which I had been in search when I was pondering over the best means of amusing her in the long autumn evenings. I parried her questions by the best excuses I could offer, changed the conversation for the next 5 minutes, and then, making a sudden remembrance of business, my apology for leaving her, hastily withdrew to devote myself to the new idea in the solitude of my own room. A little quiet thinking convinced me that I had discovered a means not only of occupying her idle time, but of decoying her into staying on with us, evening by evening, until my son's return. The new project which she had herself unconsciously suggested involved nothing less than acting forthwith on her own chance hint, and appealing to her interest and curiosity by the recital of incidents and adventures drawn from my own personal experience, and, if I could get them to help me, from the experience of my brothers as well. Strange people and startling events had connected themselves with Owen's past life as a clergyman, with Morgan's past life as a doctor, and with my past life as a lawyer, which offered elements of interest of a strong and striking kind ready to our hands. If these narratives were written plainly and unpretendingly, if one of them was read every evening under circumstances that should pique the curiosity and impress the imagination of our young guest, the very occupation was found for her weary hours which would gratify her tastes, appeal to her natural interest in the early lives of my brothers and myself, and lure her insensibly into prolonging her visit by 10 days without exciting a suspicion of our real motive for detaining her. I sat down at my desk. I hid my face in my hands to keep out all impressions of external and present things, and I searched back through the mysterious labyrinth of the past, through the dun, ever-deepening twilight of the years that were gone. Slowly, out of the awful shadows, the ghosts of memory rose about me. The dead population of a vanished world came back to life round me, a living man. Men and women whose earthly pilgrimage had ended long since returned upon me from the unknown spheres, and fond, familiar voices burst their way back to my ears through the heavy silence of the grave. Moving by me in the nameless inner light, which no eye saw but mine, the dead procession of immaterial scenes and beings unrolled its silent length. I saw once more the pleading face of a friend of early days, with the haunting vision that had tortured him through life by his side again, with the long-forgotten despair in his eyes which had once touched my heart and bound me to him, till I had tracked his destiny through its darkest windings to the end. I saw the figure of an innocent woman passing to and fro in an ancient country house, with the shadow of a strange suspicion stealing after her wherever she went. I saw a man worn by hardship and old age, stretched dreaming on the straw of a stable, and muttering in his dream the terrible secret of his life. Other scenes and persons followed these, less vivid in their revival, but still always recognizable and distinct. A young girl alone by night, and in peril of her life, in a cottage on a dreary moor. An upper chamber of an inn, with 2 beds in it, the curtains of one bed closed, and a man standing by them. Waiting, yet dreading to draw them back. A husband secretly following the first traces of a mystery which his wife's anxious love had fatally hidden from him since the day when they first met. These, and other visions like them, shadowy reflections of the living beings and the real events that had been once, peopled the solitude and the emptiness around me. They haunted me still when I tried to break the chain of thought which my own efforts had wound about my mind. They followed me to and fro in the room, and they came out with me when I left it. I had lifted the veil from the past for myself, and I was now to rest no more till I had lifted it for others. I went at once to my eldest brother, and showed him my son's letter, and told him all that I have written here. His kind heart was touched as mine had been. He felt for my suspense, he shared my anxiety, he laid aside his own occupation on the spot. "Only tell me," he said, "how I can help, and I will give every hour in the day to you and to George." I had come to him with my mind almost as full of his past life as of my own. I recalled to his memory events in his experience as a working clergyman in London. I set him looking among papers which he had preserved for half his lifetime, and the very existence of which he had forgotten long since. I recalled to him the names of persons to whose necessities he had ministered in his sacred office, and whose stories he had heard from their own lips, or received under their own handwriting. When we parted, he was certain of what he was wanted to do, and was resolute on that very day to begin the work. I went to Morgan next, and appealed to him as I had already appealed to Owen. It was only part of his odd character to start all sorts of eccentric objections in reply, to affect a cynical indifference, which he was far from really and truly feeling, and to indulge in plenty of quaint sarcasm on the subject of Jessie and his nephew George. I waited till these little surface ebullitions had all expended themselves, and then pressed my point again with the earnestness and anxiety that I really felt. Evidently touched by the manner of my appeal to him even more than by the language in which it was expressed, Morgan took refuge in his customary abruptness, spread out his paper violently on the table, seized his pen and ink, and told me quite fiercely to give him his work and let him tackle it at once. I set myself to recall to his memory some very remarkable experiences of his own in his professional days, but he stopped me before I had half done. "I understand," he said, taking a savage dip at the ink. "I'm to make her flesh creep, and to frighten her out of her wits. I'll do it with a vengeance." Reserving to myself privately an editorial right of supervision over Morgan's contributions, I returned to my own room to begin my share, by far the largest one of the task before us. The stimulus applied to my mind by my son's letter must have been a strong one indeed, for I had hardly been more than an hour at my desk before I found the old literary facility of my youthful days, when I was a writer for the magazines, returning to me as if by magic. I worked on unremittingly till dinner-time, and then resumed the pen after we had all separated for the night. At 2 o'clock the next morning I found myself, God help me, masquerading, as it were, in my own long-lost character of a hard-writing young man, with the old familiar cup of strong tea by my side, and the old familiar wet towel tied round my head. My review of the progress I had made, when I looked back at my pages of manuscript, yielded all the encouragement I wanted to drive me on. It is only just, however, to add to the record of this first day's attempt, that the literary labour which it involved was by no means of the most trying kind. The great strain on the intellect, the strain of invention, was spared me by my having real characters and events ready to my hand. If I had been called on to create, I should, in all probability, have suffered severely by contrast with the very worst of those unfortunate novelists whom Jessie had so rashly and so thoughtlessly condemned. It is not wonderful that the public should rarely know how to estimate the vast service which is done to them by the production of a good book, seeing that they are, for the most part, utterly ignorant of the immense difficulty of writing even a bad one. The next day was fine, to my great relief, and our visitor, while we were at work, enjoyed her customary scamper on the pony and her customary rambles afterward in the neighbourhood of the house. Although I had interruptions to contend with on the part of Owen and Morgan, neither of whom possessed my experience in the production of what heavy people call light literature, and both of whom consequently wanted assistance, still I made great progress, and earned my hours of repose on the evening of the second day. On that evening I risked the worst, and opened my negotiations for the future with the Queen of Hearts. About an hour after the tea had been removed, and when I happened to be left alone in the room with her, I noticed that she rose suddenly and went to the writing-table. My suspicions were aroused directly, and I entered on the dangerous subject by inquiring if she intended to write to her aunt. "Yes," she said. "I promised to write when the last week came. If you had paid me the compliment of asking me to stay a little longer, I should have returned it by telling you I was sorry to go. As it is, I mean to be sulky and say nothing." With those words, she took up her pen to begin the letter. "Wait a minute," I remonstrated. "I was just on the point of begging you to stay when I spoke." "Were you indeed?" she returned. "I never believed in coincidences of that sort before, but now, of course, I put the most unlimited faith in them." "Will you believe in plain proofs?" I asked, adopting her humour. "How do you think I and my brothers have been employing ourselves all day today and all day yesterday? Guess what we have been about. "Congratulating yourselves in secret on my approaching departure," she answered, tapping her chin saucily with the feather end of her pen. I seized the opportunity of astonishing her, and forthwith told her the truth. She started up from the table and approached me with the eagerness of a child, her eyes sparkling and her cheeks flushed. "Do you really mean it?" she said. I assured her that I was in earnest. She thereupon not only expressed an interest in our undertaking, which was evidently sincere, but, with characteristic impatience, wanted to begin the first evening's reading on that very night. I disappointed her sadly by explaining that we required time to prepare ourselves, and by assuring her that we should not be ready for the next 5 days. On the 6th day, I added, we should be able to begin, and to go on, without missing an evening for probably 10 days more. "The next 5 days," she replied. "Why, that will just bring us to the end of my 6 weeks' visit. I suppose you are not setting a trap to catch me. This is not a trick of you 3 cunning old gentlemen to make me stay on, is it?" I quailed inwardly as that dangerously close guess at the truth passed her lips. "You forget," I said, "that the idea only occurred to me after what you said yesterday. If it had struck me earlier, we should have been ready earlier, and then where would your suspicions have been?" "I am ashamed of having felt them," she said in her frank, hearty way. "I retract the word trap, and I beg pardon for calling you 3 cunning old gentlemen. But what am I to say to my aunt?" She moved back to the writing table as she spoke. "Say nothing," I replied, "till you have heard the first story. Shut up the paper case till that time, and then decide when you will open it again to write to your aunt." She hesitated and smiled. That terribly close guess of hers was not out of her mind yet. "I rather fancy," she said slyly, "that the story will turn out to be the best of the whole series." "Wrong again," I retorted. "I have a plan for letting chance decide which of the stories the first one shall be. They shall be all numbered as they are done. Corresponding numbers shall be written inside folded pieces of card and well mixed together. You shall pick out any one card you like, you shall declare the number written within, and, good or bad, the story that answers to that number shall be the story that is read." "Is that fair?" "Fair," she exclaimed. "It's better than fair. It makes me of some importance, and I must be more or less than woman not to appreciate that." "Then you consent to wait patiently for the next 5 days?" "As patiently as I can." "And you engage to decide nothing about writing to your aunt until you have heard the first story?" "I do," she said, returning to the writing table. "Behold the proof of it." She raised her hand with theatrical solemnity and closed the paper case with an impressive bang. I leaned back in my chair with my mind at ease for the first time since the receipt of my son's letter. Only let George return by the 1st of November, I thought to myself, and all the aunts in Christendom shall not prevent Jessie Yelverton from being here to meet him. The 10 days. The first day. Showery and unsettled. In spite of the weather, Jessie put on my mackintosh cloak and rode off over the hills to one of Owen's outlying farms. She was already too impatient to wait quietly for the evening's reading in the house, or to enjoy any amusement less exhilarating than a gallop in the open air. I was, on my side, as anxious and as uneasy as our guest. Now that the 6 weeks of her stay had expired, now that the day had really arrived, on the evening of which the first story was to be read, I began to calculate the chances of failure as well as the chances of success. What if my own estimate of the interest of the stories turned out to be a false one? What if some unforeseen accident occurred to delay my son's return beyond 10 days? The arrival of the newspaper had already become an event of the deepest importance to me. Unreasonable as it was to expect any tidings of George at so early a date, I began, nevertheless, on this first of our days of suspense, to look for the name of his ship in the columns of telegraphic news. The mere mechanical act of looking was some relief to my overstrained feelings, although I might have known, and did know, that the search, for the present, could lead to no satisfactory result. Toward noon, I shut myself up with my collection of manuscripts to revise them for the last time. Our exertions had thus far produced but 6 of the necessary 10 stories. As they were only, however, to be read, one by one, on 6 successive evenings, and as we could therefore count on plenty of leisure in the daytime, I was in no fear of our failing to finish the little series. Of the 6 completed stories I had written 2, and had found a third in the form of a collection of letters among my papers. Morgan had only written one, and this solitary contribution of his had given me more trouble than both my own put together, in consequence of the perpetual intrusion of my brother's eccentricities in every part of his narrative. The process of removing these quaint turns and frisks of Morgan's humour, which, however amusing they might have been in an essay, were utterly out of place in a story appealing to suspended interest for its effect, certainly tried my patience and my critical faculty, such as it is more severely than any other part of our literary enterprise which had fallen my share. Owen's investigations among his papers had supplied us with the two remaining narratives. One was contained in a letter, and the other in the form of a diary, and both had been received by him directly from the writers. Besides these contributions, he had undertaken to help us by some work of his own, and had been engaged for the last 4 days in moulding certain events which had happened within his personal knowledge into the form of a story. His extreme fastidiousness as a writer interfered, however, so seriously with his progress that he was still sadly behindhand, and was likely, though less heavily burdened than Morgan or myself, to be the last to complete his allotted task. Such was our position, and such the resources at our command, when the first of the 10 days dawned upon us. Shortly after 4 in the afternoon, I completed my work of revision, numbered the manuscripts from 1 to 6, exactly as they happened to lie under my hand, and enclosed them all in a portfolio, covered with purple morocco, which became known from that time by the imposing title of the Purple Volume. Miss Jessie returned from her expedition just as I was tying the strings of the portfolio, and, womanlike, instantly asked leave to peep inside, which favour I, manlike, positively declined to grant. As soon as dinner was over, our guest retired to array herself in magnificent evening costume. It had been arranged that the readings were to take place in her own sitting-room, and she was so enthusiastically desirous to do honour to the occasion that she regretted not having brought with her from London the dress in which she had been presented at court the year before, and not having borrowed certain materials for additional splendour, which she briefly described as aunt's diamonds. Toward 8 o'clock we assembled in the sitting-room, and a strangely assorted company we were. At the head of the table, radiant in silk and jewellery, flowers and furbelows, sat the Queen of Hearts, looking so handsome and so happy that I secretly congratulated my absent son on the excellent taste he had shown in falling in love with her. Round this bright young creature, Owen at the foot of the table, and Morgan and I on either side, sat her 3 wrinkled, grey-headed, dingily attired hosts, and just behind her, in still more inappropriate companionship, towered the spectral figure of the man in armour, which had so unaccountably attracted her on her arrival. This strange scene was lighted up by candles in high and heavy brass sconces. Before Jessie stood a mighty china punch-bowl of the olden time, containing the folded pieces of card, inside which were written the numbers to be drawn, and before Owen reposed the purple volume from which one of us was to read. The walls of the room were hung all round with faded tapestry, the clumsy furniture was black with age, and, in spite of the light from the sconces, the lofty ceiling was almost lost in gloom. If Rembrandt could have painted our background, Reynolds our guest, and Hogarth ourselves, the picture of the scene would have been complete. When the old clock over the tower gateway had chimed 8, I rose to inaugurate the proceedings by requesting Jessie to take one of the pieces of card out of the punch-bowl and to declare the number. She laughed, then suddenly became frightened and serious, then looked at me and said, "It was dreadfully like business," and then entreated Morgan not to stare at her, or, in the present state of her nerves, she should upset the punch-bowl. At last she summoned resolution enough to take out one of the pieces of card and to unfold it. "Declare the number, my dear," said Owen. "Number 4, answered Jessie, making a magnificent courtesy and beginning to look like herself again. Owen opened the purple volume, searched through the manuscripts, and suddenly changed colour. The cause of his discomposure was soon explained. Malicious fate had assigned to the most diffident individual in the company the trying responsibility of leading the way. Number 4 was one of the 2 narratives which Owen had found among his own papers. "I am almost sorry," began my eldest brother confusedly, "that it has fallen to my turn to read first. I hardly know which I distrust most, myself or my story." "Try and fancy you are in the pulpit again," said Morgan sarcastically. "Gentlemen of your cloth, Owen, seldom seem to distrust themselves or their manuscripts when they get into that position." "The fact is," continued Owen, mildly impenetrable to his brother's cynical remark, "that the little thing I am going to try and read is hardly a story at all. I'm afraid it is only an anecdote. I became possessed of the letter which contains my narrative under these circumstances. At the time when I was a clergyman in London, my church was attended for some months by a lady who was the wife of a large farmer in the country. She had been obliged to come to town, and to remain there for the sake of one of her children, a little boy who required the best medical advice." At the words, "medical advice," Morgan shook his head and growled to himself contemptuously. Owen went on. "While she was attending in this way to one child, his share in her love was unexpectedly disputed by another, who came into the world rather before his time. I baptized the baby, and was asked to the little christening party afterward. This was my first introduction to the lady, and I was very favourably impressed by her. Not so much on account of her personal appearance, for she was but a little woman, and had no pretensions to beauty, as on account of a certain simplicity and hearty, downright kindness in her manner, as well as of an excellent frankness and good sense in her conversation. One of the guests present, who saw how she had interested me, and who spoke of her in the highest terms, surprised me by inquiring if I should ever have supposed that quiet, good-humoured little woman to be capable of performing an act of courage which would have tried the nerves of the boldest man in England. I naturally enough begged for an explanation, but my neighbour at the table only smiled and said, "If you can find an opportunity, ask her what happened at the Black Cottage, and you will hear something that will astonish you." I acted on the hint as soon as I had an opportunity of speaking to her privately. The lady answered that it was too long a story to tell then, and explained, on my suggesting that she should relate it on some future day, that she was about to start for her country home the next morning. "But," she was good enough to add, "as I have been under great obligations to you for many Sundays past, and as you seem interested in this matter, I will employ my first leisure time after my return in telling you by writing, instead of by word of mouth, what really happened to me on one memorable night of my life in the Black Cottage." She faithfully performed her promise. In a fortnight afterward I received from her the narrative which I am now about to read.